Okay, hello and welcome again here to my home here in New Zealand. We are now entering week 4 of our full lockdown, which we call level 4 here in New Zealand. I hope wherever you are watching that you are safe. You can see behind me that the webinar is starting right now at 1:30 Indian Standard Time. I put that up on the board because I know so many of you are watching in India. It's 8 o'clock here in New Zealand. The last webinar, we looked at grammar. And we looked at complex sentences which use subordinating conjunctions, the kind of standard type where you have an independent clause and a dependent clause. Today we're going to build upon that and look at another variety or two other varieties of complex sentences, relative clauses and WH clauses. So if this is the first time you're watching, my name is Greg. This is actually webinar 10 of a series of webinars which I've been running during lockdown. Obviously the focus is on grammar, but if you go to the Grade website or on the Grade Facebook page, you'll see a series of different webinars where we covered writing tasks too. So this week we've been focusing especially on grammar and some different structures to give you a wider range of grammar as per the band descriptors. Now, you should be able to find the worksheet which we're going to go through today. It's on the Grade Facebook page. It's also on the Grade site. And after this webinar on the Grade site, you'll be able to practice, review those questions as a self-study tool. But if you don't have the worksheet in front of you, it's okay because I'm going to slowly reveal all the questions as we go through the webinar. But first of all, let's start. And I want to explain, demonstrate, show you what relative clauses are all about. So I've been thinking really hard about this, how to condense this into what essentially is an approximately 1-hour webinar. Relative clauses are not easy. So what I'm going to show you here today are some structures or relative clauses, aspects of relative clauses, which are going to help you on the IELTS test. You may be watching and you may think there are other things which you've left out. That's probably true. So I'm showing you about relative clauses with a test focus, that IELTS test, right? So you'll see here I've referred to them as RC. So the easiest way to think about a relative clause is it's part of a sentence which has 2 clauses or more. The relative clause tells us more about a noun, right? Whether it be a person, an animal, or a thing. And it could also be a place, time, or a reason. So in black here, these are known as relative pronouns. These are the words. You might think of them as conjunctions also, but most books are going to say relative pronouns that combine the 2 clauses together to make a relative clause. I'll give you a bit of time to digest, to look at the different relative pronouns here on the chart. Maybe the writing is a little small. It was quite hard to get everything on one page. So I'll read them out for you. Person, thing or animal, place, time, and reason. Just as above here. By subject and object and possessive, we're looking at parts of a sentence. So last webinar, you might remember this one here. I'm just going to give one example this time. I am a teacher, simple sentence. Subject is I, SUB. You might see me use that again. And here is the verb. Now, a teacher is the object, right? So that's why I've divided these here on the chart, because there is an important distinction sometimes with relative clauses between the subject and the object. So see if you can try remember the various relative pronouns. When we do the worksheet, I'm going to leave a gap in a sentence, and you're going to be filling in some of those sentences with different relative pronouns. So let's move along And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the two types of relative clauses. So you're probably looking at this and you're seeing a big wall of text, a lot of writing here. Don't worry too much because the blue, they are examples, right? So the black is what I'm trying to show you at the moment. So as I said, just so I erase this, there are two types of relative clauses. So you're going to see this word essential, right? So defining relative clauses, they add essential information to a sentence. Now, what is essential is basically up to you as the speaker or writer. But what it means is it's adding essential meaning, right? So have a look at the first example. Kindergarten is a place where preschoolers can develop social skills, right? So to have full meaning in this sentence, the speaker or the writer in this case needs to include the relative clause, right? Without it, it wouldn't be a very meaningful sentence, right? Kindergarten is a place. That's a simple sentence, but here the speaker or the writer is saying the relative clause where preschoolers can develop social skills is essential information, right? To give that sentence full meaning. Another example. Now, about the examples themselves, I've tried to create most of them in relation to some of the essays we've looked at in previous webinars, the essays that you can practice on the grade site. So global warming is one of the biggest threats that humans face in the 21st century. Now, some of you have probably already worked out that you don't need to include that. And on the grade site, if you practice this question, you'll notice that on the grade site, that is omitted. That's a feature of defining relative clauses. So the relative pronoun can only be omitted when it is the object of the clause. That's really important to understand. Now, let me give you an example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one here. Here, this can be omitted because it relates to the object of the clause. Now, to demonstrate that, this is what I'll do. So let's imagine that this is one sentence, right? So global warming is one of the biggest threats. And if we were to make a second sentence, we could say humans face one of the biggest threats. I'm not going to write out century, I'm just going to list it as C. Now, you can see what's been repeated here, right? So global warming is one of the biggest threats. Humans face one of the biggest threats in the 21st century. This is why we make it into a relative clause, because we don't need to repeat the same thing twice. And this is what I mean here, where it says, if it is the object of the relative clause, then we can get rid of that, right? So in this case, that is optional. Now, when you're doing writing, especially in the IELTS, I would just say keep it in because it's highlighting to the examiner that you are making or you are forming a relative clause. And again, in the IELTS, you want to show off a wide range of grammar. Let's have a look at non-defining relative clauses. Now, at any stage, you might see me look over to the side. I'm looking at my computer screen, so don't feel afraid. Please contact me via the grade Facebook page if you have any questions or you want to contribute anything. I'm always looking. Okay, so another big body of text, but just remember again, the blue, these are example sentences. So the black is what I'm hoping you'll pick up from my explanation here. So in contrast or in comparison to defining relative clauses, non-defining relative clauses add extra or non-essential information. In other words, without the relative clause, the sentence would still be very meaningful, right? So let's have a look. Tuvalu, now listen to the way I speak it because you'll notice a change in my intonation. Tuvalu, which is just meters above sea level, is suffering from the effects of climate change. So you'll notice a little pause, little change in intonation to add that extra information when I speak. When I write, I'm using commas too, right? So that's another difference. Non-defining relative clauses, you need those commas. Another one, many preschoolers attend kindergartens, which are great places to develop social skills. So essentially, I've added on some extra information using which. Now, I would say of the two different sentence structures here, this one is easier for most students to include on the IELTS writing test in particular. Or think about this when you're speaking in the speaking test, you could just add a little bit of extra information very simply using the non-defining relative clause, right? So it's like an extra bit of information. In other words, you've already got a meaningful sentence, but you just add some extra on. Really nice tip. And just to recap, sentences with non-defining relative clauses, I'll get a red pen, it's easier to see. They have commas, right? We can see the commas, just one here in this case. And this is another thing. There are lots of things, potential mistakes which people can make. When you have a non-defining relative clause, this is where it's confusing. You can only use which, but you cannot use that. That's the difference, right? So I'm going to contrast that with the previous example. So here's our example about global warming. Global warming is one of the biggest threats that humans face in the 21st century. Now, I purposely have used that here to make that point. I could use which, that would be fine. So with a defining relative clause, you have a choice. You can use which or that. But with a non-defining relative clause, we have to use which. Okay, so that's the big difference between the two. And that's why most grammar books divide them so they can make those distinctions. Finally, as I've already sort of said, if I remove the relative clause from a non-defining relative clause, then I still have a meaningful sentence. So in other words, Tuvalu is suffering from the effects of climate change. That's still a worthwhile, meaningful sentence, right? Many preschoolers attend kindergartens. Again, that's still a worthwhile, meaningful sentence. So that's the big difference. Those are the differences, right? The differences between defining and non-defining. Let's have a look at some WH clauses. Now, I've touched upon those in previous webinars where we looked at writing. So I hope this is a bit of a review for some of you. Now you can see here with the title, I've said WH clauses for IELTS. So I'm only picking one structure. There are different structures for WH clauses, but I'm just going to use one structure. We're going to talk about that structure or form very shortly, but I always like to compare or teach relative clauses and WH clauses at the same time, because I know a lot of students get very confused between the two. And in my experience, that's the source of many mistakes and errors. Now, WH clauses, they're using a lot of the same words, which are the relative pronouns in relative clauses. But the easiest way to distinguish the difference is that with WH clauses, we're using verbs of thinking and verbs of saying, right? So that's an easy way to spot the difference. So for example, verbs of thinking: know, understand, suppose, remember, forget, wonder. There are others. These are just some examples. Verbs of saying: ask, say, admit, reply, agree, mention, explain, suggest. What happens is we use a WH word after these verbs of thinking and saying, and then we add on another clause, right? So this is the form I'm going to show you in a second. So with our relative clauses, the basic form, we have a noun, then we have a relative pronoun, and then we have a clause or the rest of a clause, right? So, right, that I've put that in brackets. We have the rest of the clause or a whole clause. With the WH clauses, we have the subject, a verb, and again, those verbs are verbs of thinking and saying. Then we have a WH word, which is in the same position as an object, right? So so again, just to review what an object is, we have subject, here's the verb. In this case, the object is our teacher. So with the WH clause, the WH word is in the same position as the object. Essentially, basically, it's the object of the first clause. Let me show you that. And this is the example I used in a previous webinar, a really tacky 1990s horror film. So I haven't written it like a title with capitalization, but it's just a phrase in this case. So I know what, right? So we have the subject. Here's our verb. And remember, this one here is a verb of thinking or saying, right? Then we have the WH word. Now, essentially, this is, like I said, it's in the same position. Well, I'm not going to write it. It's in the same position as the object of a simple sentence. Then we have, where are we? We have the rest of the sentence, which is another clause, right? So you did last summer. Okay, so again, remember, a clause has the basic elements of a subject and a verb at least, right? So there's another clause. Subject and a verb, right? So here is our WH clause. I'll make that very clear for you. So I'm not going to go into the form of relative clauses because when you do the worksheets, you'll be able to identify the difference, and I don't want to overcomplicate it. But again, in blue, I have some examples. These ones here are all WH clauses, right? So I know what you did last summer, right? I will show, right? So I will show, will is a modal verb. I will show how, right? And then the next clause, right? So moderate taxes give people enough incentive to work hard, right? So I will show how, right? That is the division there, and there's the rest, that next clause, right? She won't admit. She won't admit what? And there's our next clause. She has done, right? So 3 WH clauses. Let's jump straight into the worksheet. But perhaps before we do that, I'll give you a chance again to review the relative pronouns for relative clauses just quickly. Okay, so just have one last look at these. Then what I'm hoping is that as we work through the worksheet, you'll be able to recall some of these. And remember, we're either going to be using these relative pronouns: person, thing or animal, place, time, and reason. Those are the different functions that we're going to combine. Or if we're not using a relative pronoun, we're going to use one of these WH words. Now, you can see with how, sometimes with how we have an adjective such as many, or an adverb such as often, after how, right? So how much does that cost, right? So those are the types of words that you're going to be filling in the worksheet. Again, if you want to find that worksheet, it's on the grade Facebook page or on the grade website. Let's jump into the worksheet. There are 10 questions. Okay, let me turn the computer on so I can see any questions. Okay, now here are the instructions. Like the last webinar, sometimes more than one answer might be possible. So if you have a different answer from what I first list on the board, don't panic, because your answer might be correct as well. Let's start off with, I think, maybe one of the easier ones, a bit of a warm-up one. Most teenage criminals will not blank, they have done. Now, this is very similar to one of the examples that I just offered you before. So let's see, I'll give you a chance at home. If you want to list the answer on the Facebook page, go for it. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay from when I see it. So you might see me looking to the right a little bit. It's just allowing for that delay. So I'll give you a little bit more time just to account for that delay if any of you want to offer the answer on the Facebook page. But I think for this one here, there's only one answer. And if your answer is what, well done. Now, what we're also going to do, as well as going through the answers, we're going to determine, well, I'm going to help you work out whether it's a relative clause or a WH clause, and then we'll just go over those forms again, right? So most teenage criminals, there's the subject, will not, which is negative form of a modal verb. Oh, I've missed out the verb, haven't I? Oh my God. That's probably why nobody's answering, because they can't understand it. Okay. Even though I check these, sometimes I mess up and I miss out something. So really sorry about that one. That's the verb which is missing. Just seen that now, obviously. So I'll give you a bit more time to digest that. Most teenage criminals. So I'll write it up on the board. So again, I'm going to underline that because it was missing to begin with. Sorry again. So most teenage criminals is the subject. You've heard me say the word modal a few times, so I'll write that up so you can see that word written. Here is our verb. And in this case, it's a verb of saying, right? So usually we say, we admit something. Now, some of you might be thinking you need to have two. Not really, you can admit it, but if you had admit to, that would be okay. Then, so this is the first part of the sentence. Then we have another clause, right? So subject, auxiliary verb, verb, right? So there's the next clause right here. They have done. right? So I'll write that up just the first time here to help you through it. Now, subject, verb, WH word, which I've left out. Oh my God, I'm having a shocker. Sorry. I'll make it better for the rest of them. So here's the WH word. And here is the rest of the sentence, which is the next clause. All right, so I just wanted to put that first one up on the board for you so you can relate it to these forms here, right? Remember, again, the form is how we make grammar grammatically accurate, right? So we need to have this form. It is part of the scoring system on the IELTS speaking and writing. You are going to be graded or scored upon your grammatical accuracy of the form, right? So again, the subject part is here. We have a modal before the verb of saying, then the WH word, then another clause, right? So that is an example of a WH clause. Okay, I'm hoping there's no more mistakes on the A1s that this is an A1 piece of paper. Hopefully there's no more mistakes. If you do notice something, please write it up. I think so far I've been error-free over the last 9 or so webinars. But anyway, please tell me if you notice anything. Let's move on to number 2. Scientists can predict, so you're going to fill in what's missing here, whether it's a relative pronoun or a WH word. Rising sea levels will wreak the most havoc, right? So I'll give you a hint. Do you think this one is a relative clause, a relative clause, or a WH clause? Think like that when you're doing these, right? So I'll give you a bit more time. I'll take a bit of time. If you want to contribute an answer on the Facebook page, I'll allow a little bit more time for that possible delay. Okay, so what's missing from here? Now, this is one where there are actually a few different possibilities. Scientists can predict, this is number 2, scientists can predict where, right? So where in the world rising sea levels will wreak the most havoc, right? So if you haven't already guessed, this is another WH clause, right? So we have verb of thinking or saying, right? We have the subject, there's another modal, verb of thinking or saying, a WH word, there's the division, and then we have another clause, another whole clause, right? So some of you might have also answered why. That's entirely possible. Obviously, it just changes the meaning of the sentence, but it's still possible, still grammatically accurate. How is also a possible answer. So all of these are possible, but in each case, it's a WH clause, right? Let's go on to number 3. Now I'm going to read them out just in case it's hard for you to see at home. The copycat killer, now here's a big hint, there's a comma, right? The copycat killer, blank, had killed 7 people, was an avid fan, there's a nice collocation, somebody who's a big fan of violent video games. Now, if you're wondering why I'm putting up these kind of random sentences, again, these are all ones which relate to essays, which we've covered in previous webinars. Take a bit of time. What do you think is the answer here to fill in the blank? Now, perhaps this is a possible error I thought of. Perhaps you might remember the examples we've been through. Some of you might have guessed which. If you did guess which, I think I can understand your logic because you're probably basing that answer on the examples. It's not right though. And I'm going to show you why, right? The copycat killer. Let's have a look. So the copycat killer, this is a person, right? So this is obviously a relative clause. We're going to use that or which for things, animals, right? So copycat killer is a person. Who is going to be the best answer? Now, the reason I'll say who is the best answer, I'm thinking in terms of the IELTS test. Yes, you could have that, but my recommendation is go for who, right? Because you're going to be using a bigger range of relative pronouns. That is a very common one, and you'll probably find in your writing you'll have the word that. You'll use it many times. So why not use variety when it's possible? So that's why I said who is the best answer. I'm only thinking in terms of the IELTS. This is what I'm helping you to prepare for. So let's go on to number 4. Okay, long sentence here. I'll read it out in case it's difficult for you to see at home. Many high school leavers are encouraged to work or travel for a year, comma, blank is known as a gap year in some countries, comma, before they enter university, right? So very similar to the last one. With the commas, hopefully you can think, okay, this is a non-defining relative clause. I'll show you again to compare. Remember with number 3 was the same. We had the commas here, right? So non-defining relative clause. What's the relative pronoun? What's the relative pronoun that we're going to need here? And I just realized I made a mistake with number 3 as well. So with relative, non-defining relative clauses, this is definitely why who is the best answer. With a non-defining relative clause, we cannot use that, right? So remember that one. So I think I confused myself from the chart. So this is going to be the same answer here. We're not going to have that because it's a non-defining relative clause. If your answer is which, well done, right? So remember who was describing a person. In this case, obviously, a year, well, traveling or working for a year, if you want to expand it. This is not a person, so we need to use which. So again, non-defining relative clauses, we're not going to use that. So I'll review that again in case you're confused. Right, so remember the note for the non-defining relative clauses. Hopefully you are recognizing the commas, which tells us that it's a non-defining relative clause. But just remember, we're going to use which, not that, or who, right? So if it's a person, who, but not that, right? So okay. Number 5. Okay, let you read one of these longer sentences again. Hopefully what you're also recognizing is, wow, these are really long sentences. But I really hope by the end of of these webinars, and especially if you review this one again today and the previous ones about the writing task 2, there's no reason without a little bit of practice why you cannot start composing some really nice long sentences like this. That's really going to put you in a higher band, both in terms of your writing, or if you produce these in the speaking test as well. Now, I would say this is one of the more difficult ones, because this is a relative pronoun which is not used as frequently, right? So, children, blank, parents read to them from an earlier age, usually develop language skills more quickly. Now, I'll give you a hint. Relationship between children and parents. Now, let's go back and we'll have a look at that chart again. So hopefully you've recognized that this is a relative clause. Well done. Okay, now I hope that you have the answer whose, right? I'm going to write that up as the answer. So again, with our relative pronouns, we have person, thing or animal, place, time, and reason. It could relate to the subject or the object of the clause, but it could also be a possessive. Now, if you don't know what I mean by possessive, possessives are words like this: my, your, what else have we got? Our. These are all our possessive adjectives, right? So I have a child. She is my daughter, right? So sounds a bit strange when I say she belongs to me, right? But she's my daughter, so it shows the relationship. Possessive is a grammar word again, so don't start thinking that I own my daughter. I know a lot of you've gone through education systems where you were taught grammar explicitly, so hopefully you know a lot of these words, which is great. All of this is known as meta language, which is the grammar or the language we use to talk about grammar. So that's a grammatical term. So we're showing the possessive here, right? So children whose parents read to them from an earlier age usually develop language skills more quickly. Now, my question for you at home, to give you a bit more of a challenge, this is a relative clause. Is it a defining or non-defining relative clause? I'm going to write the answer up soon in red pen. Now, what am I pointing at? Hopefully on your screen you can see commas. So if you've identified in example number 5 that there are no commas, then hopefully you've come to the conclusion this is a defining relative clause. So well done if you, first of all, if you have the answer whose. This is one of the more difficult ones. And if you're starting to identify the different types of relative clauses, if you identified it as defining, that's great. So I pointed to the commas because the commas are going to be in non-defining. Remember, with non-defining, we could take out this part and we would have a meaningful sentence. But here, the speaker or the writer includes this part here, whose parents read to them from an earlier age, right? That's the relative clause. That gives it necessary, essential meaning. And without it, the sentence would not have anywhere near the same meaning, right? So that's the big difference. Let's go on to number 6. Again, I hope at home you're thinking about the commas. Now, this is the type of one where I think a lot of students will get confused between WH clauses and relative clauses. I want you to think very carefully about the verb here, right? So the verb is copy. And I'll review again, always just I believe in a lot of repetition, a lot of review. So the example from number 6, in that example, the verb is copy. Is copy a verb of thinking or is it a verb of saying? Right, so obviously it's not. So that means it's not a WH clause. Hopefully you can start remembering these simple rules to distinguish the two. And because it's not a WH clause, you're not going to be filling it in with a WH word. Rather, the blank is going to be filled with one of these relative pronouns, right? So one of these words here. Now, I know it's confusing because, you know, who, where, when, and why are WH words as well, but we're looking at them, we're using them in a different way. Now, again, just to review, commas here, no commas. So number 6, defining relative clause, right? Remember, there's no commas. That means there are two possible answers. Here we could have which or that. Now, again, I would suggest, in terms of the IELTS test, for the purpose of the IELTS test, I would probably recommend using which, because in most cases, that is going to be used often in the rest of your writing. So why not demonstrate a variety of relative pronouns? Okay, so let's move on to the last page of this worksheet. Obviously, this is getting a bit heavy. This is the longest webinar I've prepared for in terms of the sheets of paper that I've used. What I'll do actually is I'll get rid of those other pieces of paper so that you can see it at home easily. Just going to put these aside. Okay, hopefully that's easier for you to read at home. If we need to refer back to anything earlier, then I'll just hang those sheets up again. But this is our last page. Number 7. Now, I really hope while I was messing around with that paper there, that you've gone ahead and you've recognized the commas. So what do the commas tell us? And if your answer is it is a non-defining relative clause, well done, right? So just think commas, non-defining relative clause. Can we use that? No, we can't, right? So that means the answer is which. Now, this is a point I want to make because I know it's a source of confusion for many people. A lot of people will say, oh, but Denmark is a place, so we should use where. The reason we don't say where is because in this case, we're not thinking about the position of Denmark, right? So when we're using where, we're thinking more about the position of something. In this case, we're thinking about Denmark being a country. Now, this is important, how I say that. If I write that on the board, Denmark is a country, I want you to think about country. What part of speech is country? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Right? Is it a preposition? Right? So remember, prepositions are in, on, where, in, on, under. Those tell us positions, right? So if your answer is noun, well done. And this is important because we're thinking about Denmark as a noun, which is why we use the relative pronoun which, and we don't use where. I know that's the source of a lot of confusion, and hopefully from me demonstrating this to you, you can see why the answer is which. Let's go on to number 8. Many parents of high school graduates worry blank, so you're going to fill that in. Their children will enter university. Now, again, hopefully you're developing your own process for doing this, and I've gone over this several times now, but looking for commas is a really good way of doing that. So now, the next thing you should be doing is you should be thinking, what kind of verb do we have here? Is it a verb of thinking or saying? So no commas. All right, so this means non-defining relative clause. Well, we know it's not this, right? So it could be a defining relative clause, or it could be a WH clause. So this is kind of like a little checklist that you can use to make sure that you're grammatically accurate. Let's have a look at the verb. The verb is worry, right? So is worry a verb of thinking or saying? Well, yes, it is, right? So we can get rid of this one, and our answer is, it's a WH clause. So hopefully that little process that I've gone through with you will help you to understand the differences. So what do you think is the best WH word to use to fill in this question or to fill in the sentence? And if your answer is when, well done. Many parents of high school graduates worry when their children will enter university. Now, another possible answer, another kind of complex sentence that we looked at last time was conditionals. Yes, that would be a possible answer, but we're not covering if today, right? So, and the difference here between when and if is likelihood, right? This would be more likely, this would be less likely, right? So I'll write that up for you. I think we're covering a lot of grammar today. So again, I've just tried to target the kind of grammar in these 3 webinars, which is going to help you with a wider range of complex sentences, a wider range of structures in your IELTS writing and speaking. You'll probably come across, well, not probably, you will come across these types of sentences in the reading test for sure, especially in section 3, I would say. And in the listening, you might hear the speakers using these structures as well. So it's going to help you across the board. But that was an example of a checklist that you can do if you really want to nail your grammatical accuracy. If you want to practice that. Let's go on to number 9. Now, I've left this one to the end because in my opinion, this is one of the most difficult ones. Now, last time we had a student say that one of the answers for a complex sentence was but. We can talk about these another time, but, and, so, they are conjunctions which we use for compound sentences, right? Compound means when we're adding things, right? So what we have here is a complex compound sentence. 3 clauses. This is the compound part. Here's the complex part. Now, this one here is, I think, the hardest one. And I'm going to give you a bit of extra time to think about the answer here. If your answer is how much, you are doing really well. This is one which is really stretching the rules of grammar here. I've spoken in the past about verbs of thinking and saying. I know it's not really clear in this case that we're using a verb of thinking or saying, but essentially we're portraying it as a thought, right? So it does not matter, right? So it does not matter how much, right? So remember with how, sometimes we can have an adverb after here. Now, the reason I think this is the most difficult one is because it's a little bit more abstract, right? So it doesn't have one of those verbs of thinking and saying used really clearly. But just think in this case, what we're doing here is this is being expressed as a thought, right? The thought is it does not matter. It does not matter how much. That's the only answer I can think of. If you have a different answer, please let me know. Otherwise, I've given you a slightly easier one to finish on today, in number 10. I will explain blank, spending more money on health and education will benefit society. I will explain blank, spending more money on health and education will benefit society. Okay, I can see there's a comment and I'm going to go back to that after we look at number 10. So I will explain, now there's a few different possibilities here. If your answer is why, well done, right? So again, this one's much clearer because we have a clear verb of thinking or saying, right? So a verb of thinking or saying is explain. I will explain why, right? Now, in some cases, with almost the same meaning, we could say how. I will explain how, right? Now, another possible answer, and we haven't really looked at these, we could also think about that, right? That is also possible. But if we do this one, then it's not a WH clause, right? But that's also a possible answer, right? So we can use that in some cases as well. So just getting back to number 8, I have a comment here. I'll write it up on the board so you can all learn from it too. In number 8, right, so question 8, is it okay to use if with will? Absolutely, right? So we talked about this on Tuesday. It's a good question, and I'm always happy to have a chance to read you. This one here will be the first condition. Right, so Remember, first conditions, we're talking about a likelihood or making a prediction. So, but the thing is, we're talking about the future. That's the key in this case, right? So you can kind of ignore the prediction likelihood part. The key here, when we use will, it relates to the future, right? So in most cases, we're going to use it to talk about likelihood or a prediction. But in this case, the most important thing is we're using it to express the future, right? So many parents of high school of high school graduates worry if their children will enter university in the future. Now, obviously the answer that I gave as well was when, right? So when would just be a stronger likelihood. If they worry if, that means they don't know or they're really not sure that they will go to university. So I hope that answers your question. I'm going to leave it here today. Again, I'll hang this up for you.